That was the takeaway, and that's how we used a little bit of a segue to get to the whole topic of what we talked about. I mean, the topic is getting a little bit old, but the importance of it isn't. The importance is that we have to take responsibility to keep our community safe. And the bottom line of everything that we learned, right, if you want to look on your reference sheet, first of all, we brought the Psakim of Rabbi Yashiv, number 43 on the reference sheet, Psakim of the Tzitz Eliezer, number 44, of Sternbuch, 45, Chutz von Hagas Rabbi Simen, Tav, Shin, Tav, Zayin, and the Chashukei Chev in Yumadav Ayin Ches Amid Aleph, and in Aleph, they all said unanimously that you have to report molesters to the police. It's a clear and cut case. There's nothing even to talk about. It's a road day. It has absolutely nothing to do with Mesira. Mesira is handing over Jewish money or Jewish lives to a corrupt government, which leads to a dangerous reality that has absolutely nothing to do with stopping dangerous people in the tracks and creating safe communities. It's a no-brainer, it's a non-starter, right? If you want to refer back to last week's shir, you can see ample sources that back up that idea, okay? Obviously there's no issue with Lashon Hara either to report such a thing. We already talked about the Shelis and Shuvas Harivash, the Algeria, the great Posik Hadar, the end of the Tkufa of the Rishonim, number 60 on your reference sheet in Siman Shun and Aleph, where he talks about Moshe Vidal, this offender, and he says he has to be publicly disgraced. Even you don't need absolute edus, you don't need hardcore testimony that would be good enough to give capital punishment on a derisa level that's good enough that you have enough incriminating evidence. It's up to the Beis Din to decide. A Kol Pascha, we saw how the Chavetz Chaim defines it. In Berman Chaim Kol Zayin, Chavetz Chaim says that keep various testimonies from various reports. Right, that's enough to create what we call a Kol Pascha. 22 testimonies from victims is way beyond what the halach requires as a Kol Pascha. Okay. It's also codified in the Shulchan Aruch. If you look at number 62 on your reference sheet in Eben Ezer Milchasod, Simin Kuf Ayin Ches If Ches. Let's just read the Shulchan Aruch. That's the bottom line of everything we learned last week. In Muchzik B'nei L'Chashul Arais, the Beit Din already is convinced that this person is committing offenses, sexual transgressions. Ro Ligabah is Nifal Aimlov. He needs to be threatened. He's allowed to be publicly shamed, he has to be warned. The Beis Din has to use every tool at their disposal to stop these offenders in their track. It's a clear and cut case. It's also rooted in the Shulchan Aruch and Chashem Mishpach, and the base of Aleph, base of the Rajba, that one of the communal responsibilities of the Beis Din is to make a safe environment and to make sure that we don't have people roaming around that could hurt us and could hurt our most vulnerable members of society. Okay? We talked about if you have a rumor that's spreading but could be tracked down, it could be tracked down to one source, it could be an embittered ex-wife, it could be an enemy that's trying to libel somebody. If the Beis Din has to do their research and if they determine that it's not various victims, it's not a number of victims raising a number of allegations, it boils down to one source. Certainly if the source of the rumors are enemies, it doesn't matter that it's running wild on the internet. Obviously the person's dignity has to be respected. We said that on a practical level there needs to be a registry so that Bati Dinim worldwide they could coordinate with each other and they could see if there's a certain accusation being made against a certain individual. Is this just a one-time accusation, or could this accusation be corroborated with other accusations made in other Bati Dinim, and could be determined this is a Kol Pascha? That's obviously a very necessary practical step that needs to be taken. Okay? Now, which brings us to number 5 on the reference sheet, number 72. In your reference sheet, this deals with a unique situation when you have a rabbinic leader, somebody who holds a rabbinic position that's being accused of misconduct. Unfortunately, this has happened quite a number of times in the last few decades, sadly enough. How do you deal with that? Okay, so number 72 on your reference sheet, the Gemara in Moed Katan Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph talks about just such a case. Okay, it's a Gemara Mefareshus, which shouldn't come as a surprise that there's nothing new under the sun. There are cases of people with prominent rabbinic positions falling into these kinds of sins. This is not something new, it's something that has happened and is even recorded in the Gemara. So the Gemara, my cousin, that Yudayin of Aleph, I would serve him Rabban, who was a certain rabbinic scholar, to have a son of Shmuel. Again, rumors were swirling. There were all sorts of reports going around that he was engaging in sexual misconduct, as the Mepharshim say. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda said, Heichel Avid, Rabbi Yehuda was in doubt. He didn't know what to do. The first option was Lashanti, to excommunicate him, to publicly disgrace him. But he said he's a rabbi who teaches Torah, and his Torah is needed. The students need his Torah. Okay, amazingly enough. So that was one option. There is a great disadvantage to excommunicating a person. On the other hand, if we don't excommunicate him, and this is what I emphasized the other week, the last Wednesday, that the Chil Hashem is not that there is a bad apple. The fact that there's a bad apple is a reality of life. It's something that's inevitable. It's something that there's nothing you can do about it. There will always be a small percentage of bad apples. The Chil Hashem is when he's not excommunicated, when he's not publicly shamed. That is the Chil Hashem. That's the desecration of the name when the community doesn't take responsibility for the bad apples. Okay, how are you? It says, so Amalei the Rabbi Baruch Chana Midishma Lebahos, Rabbi Yehuda went to consult with another great sage of his time, Rabbi Baruch Chana, and he said, do you know anything? How are we to react in such a situation? Rabbi Miller, there's a reference sheet at the entrance, at the reception, if you want to take as a reference sheet. Thanks so much. So, how do we react? So Amalei Hacham Rabbi Yochanan, this is Rabbi Yochanan, said, Maidas ki sifte kohen yishmu dat, the Torah Yivakshu Mipiyu Ki Malach Hashem Tzvaketu. What does that pasuk teach us? If you have a rabbi, a teacher of Torah, that is a good, upstanding man, he's a man of great morals, like a Malach Elokim, like an angel of Hashem, Yivakshu Torah Mipiyu, then you should learn Torah from him. If not, Ayivakshu Torah Mipiyu, don't learn Torah from such an individual. So therefore, Shamtu Rabbi Yehuda publicly excommunicated the Torah scholars. So what the Gemara in Morav Yudayin is telling us, that you can have a very great Torah sage, and in fact the students even need his Torah, but you should not be learning from a person that has who's not moral, a person that doesn't have a good ethical standing. It's not worthwhile to learn Torah from such a person. Okay, so therefore you publicly excommunicate. Number 73 in your reference sheet. The continuation of the Gemara seems to say the opposite. The Gemara seems to backtrack on what it just said. Amrei Shlakish, Sever Shlakish, Tam Chacham Shesarach. He had a Torah scholar, Shesarach, his behavior turned very badly. Ein Menadin Oto Befarhesed. You do not publicly excommunicate him. Shemar V'chashal Tayyad, V'chashal Gam Novi, Im Chalayla Kisel V'layla. If you have a prophet, a great Torah sage that has fell into sin, you don't publicize it, cover it up. So how do you reconcile the contradiction in the Gemara? On one hand, Rabbi Yehuda said, he's not like a Malach Elokim. If the teacher is not like a Malach, it's not like an angel, it's not worthwhile learning Torah from him, so therefore you need to publicly put it into excommunication. Then Rish Lakish tells us that you cover it up. So how do you reconcile this contradiction? So number 74 in your reference sheet, the Rosh, right? The Rosh, he deals with this. He deals with the contradiction, and he says it depends. Sometimes people have personal failures in the private life, but they're not a public disgrace of Hashem's name. So therefore, if we have personal failures, it's not respectful to publicize it. There's no need to publicize the fact that a certain rabbi had a personal failure in his own life, and therefore you maintain his dignity, and therefore you push it to the side, you don't publicize it. However, says the Rosh, if it's something that's a chil Hashem, it's a public desecration of Hashem's name, his behavior in public is not becoming, it's an embarrassment to the Torah, so therefore the other Torah scholars need to publicly excommunicate him, otherwise it's a chil Hashem. I would say that it's 100% obvious, it doesn't even need to be said, but I'll emphasize it anyways because it's so important. If he's a public threat, of course you need to report it, and that already belongs to last week's shir. We said that if there's anybody that's a public threat, it's what we said, taking victims, there's a communal responsibility to make the community safe, obviously it goes without saying. But even if the Torah scholar is not a public threat, he's not a threat, but his behavior in public is unacceptable, then you need to publicly excommunicate him. If his public behavior is okay, he's behaving okay in public, he did something in his private life that's not okay, he has misdeeds in his private life, then you keep it quiet, right? You, as they say, shove it under the rug, because again, number one, he's not a public threat, and number two, his public behavior is in line. Okay, so that's the way the Rosh
apply to somebody who's not a prominent person, not a tzur with the Rabban.
This is a good question. I thought about the same question that Yisaf was asking. After the Rosh, it says, so what difference is there between a Talmud Chacham and an ordinary person? So I would say that when it comes to Talmud Chacham, again, if his failures is only in his personal life, then there's an obligation to maintain his dignity. Whereas for a normal person, there's no specific obligation to do what you can to actively pursue that his public misdeeds should not become public. But if this is a Torah scholar, and as I said, I've emphasized this a few times, I don't want to be taken out of context, I don't want to be misunderstood. But again, if he's not a public threat and his public behavior is in line, it's personal, then we actually have an obligation to make sure that his dignity is maintained more so than with an ordinary person. Okay? So that goes without saying. So therefore, if you have, no matter how great the rabbi is, he could be a Rosh Hashiva, he could be a big rav, it doesn't make a difference. If he's a public threat or his public behavior is a chilul Hashem, a desecration of Hashem's name, then you need to put him in excommunication. He needs to be publicly disgraced, as we saw, as Rabbi Yehuda had done to this Rosh Hashiva who had misbehavior. Okay, that's the ruling of the Rambam in 75. You can look at it, and also in number 76 in Yeridea, in Simin Shimla, Medal, Sif, and Beis. That's the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. It's a quote from the Rambam that if you have a Chacham or an Av Beit Din, this could even be the Av Beit Din, this could even be at the head of the Beit Din. So you see that even people of very great rabbinic prominence have the capacity to fail in very serious ways. But therefore, if it's a personal failure, you don't publicize it. You look at the second paragraph there in the Shulchan Aruch and Simin Shimla Beis Ardea. V'sori shmu'ane he's at the bar drinking alcohol and behaving like a drunk. Okay, that's one of the examples that the Shulchan Aruch said. That's a chilul Hashem. That's a disgraceful public behavior. His behavior is an embarrassment to his colleagues. Okay, you can have even an Av Beit Din, the head of the Beit Din behaves in such a way that brings great embarrassment to his colleagues. So that's a public chilul Hashem, and he needs to be, thank you so much. He has to be excommunicated and needs to be publicly shamed so as to prevent the chilul Hashem that we saw in Moed Katan Daf Yud Zayin. So everything that we see, number one, we've seen everything is strongly based, is strongly rooted in the Gemaras, and everything is codified in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so there's no doubts about what to do. Now, if you look at number 7, yeah?
Is it correct to assume that these are subjective criteria, depending on the president?
Yes, so it is a bit subjective, you're right. What does it mean that his colleagues are shamed by his behavior? You have, that is something subjective, and it's the obligation that they tend to determine, does this behavior qualify as something that embarrasses his colleagues? Correct? Yeah, this could become, there are certain gray areas where it could become subjective. Now, first of all, usually, and this is something that Rabbi Yitzchak Reitowitz wrote up about at length, and he talked about very often when people fail in these areas, it's obviously rooted in no, it's not just a matter of not being able to control lust. It's usually rooted in very bad midot. It's rooted in very bad character traits, arrogance, and the like. In fact, that's what the Gemara in Sotah Avdal Ramabei says, the person is exceedingly arrogant. If a person is arrogant, he ends up stumbling in adultery, which makes sense. If a person is arrogant, he doesn't feel that he's confined by certain basic limits. He thinks that he could take somebody else's wife. He thinks that he could mistreat and he could abuse and molest vulnerable people. It's rooted in a certain arrogance. If a person has a certain level of humility, a certain level of compassion, he doesn't fall to these things. Okay, we go on in the Dharma, the Chaf Amar Aleph says, Kol Adam HaMizbayis Shodem Herochayim. If a person has a certain shyness or a certain humility, he doesn't sin very quickly. It takes a great degree of brazenness to approach a vulnerable victim or to work with somebody else's wife. It shows that there's a lack of dignity, it shows that there's a lack of humility there, okay? And very often, as Rabbi was pointed out in this very good article, very often people that engage in this type of behavior have extreme failings in their humility. For example, this Walder, people who knew him, this was a very arrogant and very aggressive human being, and that's why he did what he did. He was able to intimidate people. He was able to prevent people from taking the necessary precautions to report things to the police because he used all sorts of methods of manipulations and threats and what have you. Okay? Now, the question is that we're going to get to, which is maybe one of the major topics of today's year, people are asking a lot, what do you do with his books? Do you keep his books or do you get rid of his books? Okay? So if you look at number 79 in your reference sheet, it's a Gemara in Gittin, Daf Mem Hey, on the base, the Gemara says, Sefer Torah shekasav min. If you have a Sefer Torah that's written by a heretic, Yisrael must burn the Sefer Torah. Kato Adek Achav, if a non-Jew wrote a Sefer Torah, Yaganim, then it needs to be hidden away. It's interesting that there was a Talmud of the Noda Yehuda, Tshuva Me'ava, and he had some of the Tshuvas that were printed was written to a non-Jewish count. I'm sorry that the name slipped me, but it was a non-Jewish count that asked him questions in halacha and Jewish philosophy, and you see that the Tshuva Me'ava had a great deal of admiration for this person. It's just an interesting thing that you have non-Jews, Philo-Semites, good upstanding non-Jews. So sometimes you have, some of the folks actually knew Hebrew, they were able to write in Hebrew. It wasn't completely unheard of to have a non-Jew that was able to write a Sefer Torah. So the Gemara Gittin talks about a non-Jew that wrote a Sefer Torah. You don't need to burn the Sefer Torah, you just need to put the Sefer Torah away. So
the person who disputed with the Ramban,
he was an apostate,
he was
right?
a Yeshua.
Right, that was the opposite side of the coin. That was a Jew that became an apostate, the one who debated with the Ramban.
Can you still use the Sefer Torah if it's written by...
No, you can't use the Sefer Torah. It's not a kosher Sefer Torah, but it doesn't need to be burned. So when the Rambam codifies this halacha, the Rambam codifies what the Gemara says, that if the Sefer Torah was written by a min, by a heretic or an apostate, it needs to be burned. Right? The Rambam codifies this. Now if you look at the bowl, the Rambam says, mitzvah l'sarfai, why do you need to burn the Sefer Torah that was written by a heretic? We don't want to leave them a legacy. We don't want it to be any living testament to the fact that there was this heretic, and we don't want to give him a name for posterity. Okay? So that's why you have to burn the Sefer Torah. It says the Rambam, sorry?
The person who wrote the Sefer Torah after he became a heretic?
Very good. Moshe Feinstein will soon very see. Mind your name. Michael was asking, what about before he became a min? We'll see very soon. Moshe Feinstein asks the question, what happens if you wrote the Sefer Torah before he became an apostate? Moshe Feinstein is going to say it's okay, and we'll see some interesting proofs that Moshe Feinstein brings to prove this point, okay? So, good question, Michael. So, the Rav Moshe Feinstein, 81, Shibligers Moshe had Beis Nun. This is also Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Shibligim Chashleim, Tinyana Beis Gimel, Simon Dalet. They both explain the obvious explanation of the Rambam. The Rambam is saying, okay, if it was written by a min, he doesn't believe that the name of Hashem has any sanctity. He doesn't see any significance in the name of Hashem, so it doesn't assume sanctity. That's the idea that Maral talks about at length, that when you write a Sefer Torah, the belief that you have that this is Hashem's name, the Yud K and the Vav K, that is what infuses the intention to write something of great sanctity, the belief that that's Hashem's name, that is what infuses the name of Hashem with its sanctity. If he doesn't believe that, and he's not writing it with the belief that this is Hashem's name, but it doesn't assume any sanctity. So the Rambam was coming to explain as follows. He says, I understand that if a min, an apostate who doesn't believe in God, wrote the Yud Kei Vav Kei, I understand why the Sefer Torah doesn't have sanctity. But why do you have to burn it? Right? Maybe you should also put it in storage, like the Sefer Torah that's written by a non-Jew. So the Rambam had to explain that if a non-Jew wrote the Sefer Torah, this was a righteous non-Jew, it's not a kosher Sefer Torah, but it doesn't need to be burned, because we're okay for this non-Jew to leave a legacy. But if it's a Rasha, if it's a wicked man, an apostate, we don't want him to leave a legacy. So it's not just that the Sefer Torah doesn't have sanctity, we actually want it to be burnt. Okay? That's the obvious explanation of the Rambam. Which leads us, what happens if it's not a Sefer Torah? Right? What happens if a Rasha, a wicked man, writes a book that's not a Sefer Torah? He writes a commentary on the Torah. Do we have the same halacha that it needs to be burned? It doesn't have the Kedusha Sefer Torah. It doesn't have the sanctity of the Sefer Torah. but must we burn it so that a wicked person doesn't leave a legacy, that he doesn't leave a remnant to his work? So this question is dealt with in the Shut Rabbi Chaim Mitzanz, in Yordech, based in Samach number 83 on your reference sheet. And the Chaim Mitzanz is actually dealing with a certain commentary on the Chumash that was written by a certain heretic. And Rabbi Chaim Mitzanz says that the same halacha that we burn a non-kosher Sefer Torah so that a wicked person doesn't leave a legacy, the same thing applies to any book that he writes. And it's very logical, okay, because the book doesn't have the Kedusha Sefer Torah, the book doesn't have the sanctity of the Sefer Torah, and therefore it only stands to reason that we should burn it so that a wicked person doesn't have the opportunity to leave a legacy. That's the pshat of Rabbi Chaim Mitzanz. Okay? Now, the Rav Moshe Feinstein, actually, I put for the right place. If you look at number 85 on your reference sheet, this is a fascinating shuk from the Igros Moshe and Ezra Chelak Aleph Sin Vav. Okay, now without meaning to offend anybody, how was this tshuva written? Somebody wrote to Rav Moshe Feinstein and said that there's a certain performer, a singer, who composes songs. Now, his behavior is not okay because he takes boys and girls and gathers them together, and he has boys and girls dance together. So his behavior is not acceptable. Are we allowed to use his tunes at Jewish weddings? That was the question of Moshe Feinstein. You don't need to be a Sherlock Holmes to figure out who this is. It was none other than the great Shlomo Carlebach, who I have a lot of admiration for, but this was the tshuva that Rav Moshe Feinstein received. So Rav Moshe Feinstein breaks up the tshuva into a few different parts, and the first thing that he deals with is Michael's questions. He says, first of all, the compositions that he made before he started to misbehave is totally okay. He says there's no issue with it whatsoever, okay? Rav Shlomo Carlebach was the Talmud of Rav Aaron Kotler. He was a very, very great Talmud Chacham. My friend Rabbi Safran, he's much older than I am. I'm friends with his son, but I spent sukkahs with him. He said that he met Rav Shlomo Carlebach, and the Rav Shlomo Carlebach asked him, "What Masechta are you learning?" He said, "I'm learning Masechet Nazir." So he said, "What daf are you learning?" He says, "Daf. I learned the daf." And Rav Carlebach on the spot rattled off the entire daf by heart.
Wow.
Okay, I heard the story firsthand from Rabbi Safran. Actually lives right here in Talbiyah, he made Aliyah, okay? His son was a good friend of mine, okay? So Carlebach was a very great Talmud Chacham. He learned to Lakewood Yeshiva. Reports has it that he was one of the few students that was able to understand the shiurim of Aaron Kotler, okay? Because Aaron Kotler would be a very complicated shiur. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says that even a heretic that wrote a Sefer Torah, if he wrote it before he became a heretic, the Sefer Torah is completely kosher. One of the proofs of Moshe Feinstein is fascinating. Number 88 on your reference sheet is the Mishnah of Perek Daled Mishnah Chav. The Mishnah brings a teaching from Elisha ben Avua. Elisha ben Avua was the teacher of Rabbi Meir, who became an apostate. He became a very great Rasha. The Mishnah there says, when Elisha ben Avua taught us, if you learn when you're young, like ink that's written on fresh parchment, the writing stays. If you learn when you're older, it's like when it's written on parchment that's already the writing has been erased there, it doesn't write well. So therefore the teaching of Elisha ben Avua was learn when you're young. When you're young, your learning stays better. So why was the Mishnah leaving the legacy of Elisha ben Avua? This is part of his legacy, the teaching that he gave us. So the answer was, since Elisha ben Avua said it before he became a heretic, you see that it's okay to leave a legacy. He says, we don't want to leave a legacy about the things that they did after they became a heretic, but before they became a heretic, it's okay to leave them a legacy. That's one of the proofs that Moshe Feinstein brings, that if a Min wrote a Sefer Torah before he became a heretic, you can keep the Sefer Torah. So therefore he says, first of all, off the bat, the compositions that he made before he started to misbehave, that's completely okay. Nothing to talk about. You can be even the biggest tzaddik in the world, you can use the composition. That's stage number one in the Shut Igros Moshe. Okay? Number 86 comes along the Igros Moshe. The Igros Moshe wants to make the argument that this halacha that we need to burn a Sefer Torah that was written by a heretic is only somebody who is a heretic, somebody who has philosophical problems. He philosophically rejects the authenticity of the Torah. But if there's somebody who misbehaves, he says, inyanam shal pritzus, promiscuity, different misbehaviors that don't pertain to the theological foundations of Judaism, he says there's no issue to have such a Sefer Torah written. Now here, Rav Moshe Feinstein, what he says, he brings a proof, which I find extremely difficult. He brings to prove this. Number 87 on your reference sheet, he brings the Shut Radvaz. We mention the Radvaz often. We'll be mentioning him very often in many different topics. The Radvaz wrote over 10,000 chuvas in his lifetime. Okay? If a person wrote over 10,000 chuvas, make a cheshbon, make a calculation how many chuvas you need to write a day to be able to write 10,000 chuvas. Okay? Just a little bit of a digression. One of the topics that are lined up is the Kuntres HaSmicha, when the Maharbi Rav of Tzfat wanted to renew the Smicha. Well, actually, maybe I'll talk about this today also, because I think it ties in maybe a little bit, I can tie it in. So, he was the head of Tzfat, and he wanted to renew the Smicha based on a Rambam in Parish of Mishnayos, in Parak Aleph of Sanhedrin, is the Parish of Mishnayos. The Rambam says that you can renew the Sanhedrin. You can renew the smicha, you need to renew the smicha in order to be able to reinstate the Sanhedrin. So the Rambam wanted to do that. The Rambam maintained that you're able to do that, but in Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Rambam said that the Rambam seemed to have backtracked a little bit, he wasn't sure about it. The Maharalbach, the Merber Rav of Tzfat, wanted to renew the smicha, and they did. Right? There was some of the Beis Yosef, of Chaim Vital, and then they sent a message to the Maharalbach, who was the Rabbi of Yerushalayim, and the Rabbi blew his top. He said, you can't do that, it's unacceptable, and they got into a big fight, and then they sent to the Radvaz, who was then in Mitzrayim, Alexandria. They asked him to issue an opinion, and the Radvaz writes in a tshuva, and he also writes this in his parish of the Chazaka, Hilchos Malachim, Hilchos Sanhedrin. The Radvaz says, in order to have smicha, you need to be a baki, you have to be able to hire you have to be on the level of scholarship that you can issue a ruling in any area of Torah. It says, I don't personally believe there's anybody in this generation that's on that level that could issue a psak in the entire Torah. So I don't believe that there's such a person around. Right? Even though he himself had written 10,000 shuvas on every single subject of halacha, but he still held that there was nobody on that level. So it's a very interesting point. So getting back to our idea, if you look at number 87, the Shut Radvaz Chel Beis Simin Tav Shin Ayin Dalid, the Rambam talks about a Sefer Torah that was written by the Korayim. Right? The Korayim was a sect, they rejected the Torah Shabbat Peh, they only accepted the Torah Shabbat, and there was a Sefer Torah written by them. So the Radvaz says that their Sefer Torah is kosher. Okay? In other words, that it's not a Sefer Torah Shekasav Min. Why? Because they believe in the Kedushas Hashem. They believe in the sanctity of Hashem's name. When they write the Yud Kei Vav Kei, they believe that that is the name of Hashem, and they believe that they're infusing sanctity into that name. So therefore, their Sefer Torah assumes the Kedusha of a kosher Sefer Torah. Now, he says, Tom Gniza, if you look at the second bottom line of there in number 88, the Shut Radvaz, the Tom Gniza, also the Baruch Allah, the Dikar Hizboi, the Tzibur, you can't read it, the Tzibur. They don't know all the halachot, all the different requirements, the technical requirements that are necessary to make a Sefer Torah kosher. So it's very possible that they didn't write the Sefer Torah in a kosher way, so therefore you have to be gonus, you need to put it away, because it might not be kosher, because they don't accept the halachot of the rabbis. So Moshe Feinstein says, if you don't need to burn the Sefer Torah of the Korayim, people that rejected the Torah Shabbat Peh, and all the more so, do you not need to reject the compositions of music or even the books that was written by somebody that's not a heretic, but somebody who behaves with preachers, somebody that behaves in a promiscuous way. That was the argument of Moshe. Now, I'm very confused with this whole argument of Moshe. I don't understand Moshe's line of reasoning. I'm confused. We certainly agree that the Karayim are heretics, right? They reject the Torah Shabbat Peh. Yud Gimel Ayin Mem, the 13 basic tenets of belief that the Rambam lays down. You have to believe in the Torah Shabbat Peh. If somebody rejects the Torah Shabbat Peh, even though he accepts the Torah Shabbat Peh, and he believes in the sanctity of the Yud Kei Vav Kei, he's certainly a heretic. So therefore, they were heretics. So why did Radvaz? So the Radvaz said, okay, so they believe in the sanctity of Hashem's name, but they're still heretics. Right? So what would Radvaz say? It's very obvious. Since the Sefer Torah has sanctity, you can't burn it. He may be a heretic, but you can't burn the holy name of Hashem. There's a law that you're not allowed to burn the name of Hashem that has assumed sanctity. So if you want to burn the Sefer Torah, you need to fulfill two prerequisites. The first prerequisite is that it's a Sefer Torah that doesn't have Kedushas Hashem, it's somebody who denies the existence of Hashem. So stage number one, the name of Hashem doesn't have sanctity. Number two, he's a Rosh, and you don't want to leave a legacy for a Rosh. Right? When it comes to the Kara'im, You fulfilled number 2, but you can fulfill number 1. You can't burn the Sefer Torah because it has sanctity. So the only option is to be guided. So why do the Radbaz say that you have to be guided because it might be possible, it might not be a kosher Sefer Torah? Say because you don't want to leave a legacy to the Karaim. The answer is he's giving a much more compelling reason. If you have a Sefer Torah from a heretic, from the Karaim, it might be possible. And you could be mashal, you could be causing all the people that will be reading from it, the tzibur, you'll be causing them to say a bracha l'batal, according to the Rash, according to the Rambam, maybe not. Okay? So he was giving me a much more compelling reason, but I don't understand what Moshe said. What Moshe said that because you don't have to burn the Sefer Torah of the Karaim, you don't have to burn the books of somebody that is only a paras. Okay, somebody's a paras, he's a very promiscuous man, he writes a Sefer Torah, you can't burn the Sefer Torah. Put it away, right? You don't want anybody to remember. Now, it depends. Or Moshe Feinstein knows that there are different levels of promiscuity, right? If somebody is he's not a mummer. We call him mummer. There's something called a mummer l'te'ava. A mummer l'te'ava means he completely rejects certain mitzvahs because he can't control himself. Okay? It's a whole complicated discussion. But in any case, if you don't want to leave a legacy for Rishayim, I think that there's a very strong argument to be made that if somebody's molester, somebody's mamsha Russia is not a wicked person that exploits people and has destroyed people's lives, right? He's not because you don't want to leave a legacy for such a person, right? So Ramosha Feinstein probably might make the argument that the whole obligation to put something away is only if it's somebody that has philosophical problems. If somebody is a heretic because he philosophically rejects the tenets of Judaism, but if it's just plain misbehavior, you can be a horrible person, but you have no issue, there's no obligation to make sure he doesn't leave a legacy. There's an argument to be made otherwise, that if a person is wicked, you don't want him to leave a legacy. Okay? But I'd like to make another argument about, first of all, just to wrap up this topic, Rav Moshe Feinstein, when he deals with the Nigunim of Karabach, he says it's totally okay. He says the Nigunim, as we said before, he started to misbehave, that's totally okay. That will be okay even if he became a min, even if he became a heretic. And he says, since he's not a heretic, he's not a mummer, he said some things that are misbehaved, he's a bit of a misbehavior, maybe he shouldn't have had boys and girls dance together, it's not something we applaud, it's not something we support, but that's not enough of a reason to say that you shouldn't place Nigunim. And therefore, Moshe Feinstein writes that you don't have to be machmir, even a Ben Torah doesn't need to be machmir. Okay? If you want to see the wording of Rav Moshe, number 85, the last line, number 85, Rav Moshe's Tshuva, please forgive me, the end of number 86, the whole section number 86. Rav Moshe Feinstein says there's no issue whatsoever. The very bottom line in number 86, if you look at the very bottom line, there's no issue with playing his compositions. You don't have to be machmer. Even a Ben Torah and a Baal Nefesh, somebody who wants to be exceedingly righteous, he doesn't need to be machmer, he could sing the songs of Karabach. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because Rav Moshe has been very often misquoted. Rav Moshe has been misquoted. People quote what's at the end of number 85 in the reference sheet. When Rav Moshe said that Baal Nefesh should be machmir, Rav Moshe Feinstein was talking about somebody who was a min. Why? Because Rav Moshe Feinstein has an interesting question. If you have, let's say, certain technologies, it's a certain car, a certain machine, and it was created by a heretic. Okay, are you allowed to call it the name? Are you allowed to call the name of the machine that has the name of this heretic? Rav Moshe Feinstein says, presumably it's okay, because we only find the chiddush that you don't want the wicked to leave a legacy, but dvarim should be kedusha. If it's something that has holiness related to it, he says a nirun, a tune, is not something of holiness. That's what Moshe Feinstein spoken like a true litzvah, right? Moshe says, he says maybe you use the tune to play songs of holiness, but the tune is not a chefs kedusha. So therefore, since the tune is not a chefs kedusha, it's not a piece of holiness. So therefore, even a heretic that makes a tune, you're allowed to use it. That's where the Hasidim, they take compositions of great
Russian,
they take Russian compositions that were probably, very likely, many of them were composed by heretics.
Some of them
yeah, many of them were very great heretics. According to Moshe, since the tune is not a chefs kedusha, you can use it. But that is where Moshe said, Yesh Baal Nefesh lahachmir. Baal Nefesh should not play the tunes in the shuls from the Russian compositions that were made by heretics. He says it's not Asr Nikradin because it's not a Chefs Dusha. So Rav Moshe's like this. Karlbach's tunes, he's not a heretic, he can for sure use them. Even a Baal Nefesh, even the biggest tzaddik in the world can sing Karlbach's composition. So he put boys and girls together. Okay, it doesn't matter,
what
it
about
wasn't
on
heretic.
like Erev Shabbos? There are many Kodibach minions on the Erev Shabbos. So they're
Yeah, so
using the
Moshe
tunes.
is totally okay. Even a Baal Nefesh doesn't need to be machmer. Rav Moshe says, when should a Baal Nefesh be machmir? A Baal Nefesh should be machmer for the Russian compositions. Okay? Now this point has been mixed up. People didn't catch this nuance. Right? So people misquote Rav Moshe by saying that Rav Moshe said that a Baal Nefesh shouldn't sing the Karabach Lubim, and it's incorrect. Rav Moshe said the opposite. The Russian composition should not be sung by a Baal Nefesh, but the tunes of Karabach, even a Baal Nefesh could sing them. Okay? So because why? What's the difference? Because the Russian compositions were made by heretics. The Karabach Lubim were not made by heretics, they were made by men that did things that were objectionable. Okay? If you believe that they were objectionable, I don't want to get anybody upset. I know there are many great admirers of Karabach, so I don't want to make anybody. He did a great deal of good. I know many people that are from because of it, so I don't want to badmouth him. I'm just trying to take the point out from Rav Moshe. Okay? So the question is, you have this book from Walder, he's writing books. Is it Darshan Kedusha or not a Darshan Kedusha? I think it is a Darshan Kedusha because it's that book that's trying to convey Torah values, Torah morals, right? So I think that these books are more problematic than tunes, because I would suspect, I don't know everything, but a great deal of what's written in these books were written as a medium to convey Torah values, so that I would be considered Darshan Kedusha. It doesn't have Kedusha say the Torah, I think that they should be burned. Now, Rav Moshe would say he wasn't a heretic. He was a molester, he was a criminal, whatever he was. Was he a heretic? Okay, Rav Moshe maybe would be matter because he's not a heretic. However, I suspect that he is a heretic. And I'll tell you why. If you look at number 84 on your reference sheet, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that's Sadi Ted, says what is the essential definition of a apikoris, of a heretic? Rav and Rabbi Chanina Amchavai, Rav and Chanina both said the same idea. Somebody who publicly disgraces a Talmud Chacham. I personally have not come across a greater Mavaz Talmud Chacham than this Walder. To write a suicide letter, to refer to two pious, upstanding Dayanim, right, in the greatest form of disgrace, right, to tell them that they're causing me, that I'm taking them to Beis Din, Shamal, utterly ridiculous stuff. There's no greater Mavaz Talmud Chacham than that. Right? And he did it publicly. He wanted the whole Klal Yisrael to look how these two pious, upstanding, who really were acting to protect victims, to save victims, and he publicly disgraced them to make them appear as murderers, and people that are going to have to appear in front of the Shamala. I think there's no greater Mavaz Tam Chacham. Therefore, according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that's Sadites, that Apikaris, if somebody is a Mavaz Tam Chacham, I would believe I ventured to say that he fits the essential definition of an Apikaris. And therefore, I think that itself is enough of a reason to get rid of the books. Okay? So I maintain adamantly that you should get rid of the books. And also, I think it's obvious. Anybody who has a bit of seichel yashin, there are so many victims to identify with the victims, to show compassion to the victims, and to stand by them, and to also send a warning to people. Right? It's to send a very clear message to any future potential offenders that we won't have your back, right? That you cannot engage in this behavior. I think that's also another very compelling reason to get rid of the books. If you look at interesting here, I brought it in the reference sheet number 90, the Tshuva Me'ava. We mentioned the Tshuva Me'ava, the Talmud of the Noyed Yehuda, because it's interesting, the Pitkei Tshuva that also brings this Tshuva Me'ava, Chelik Aleph, Simon Kufiyot, he talks about the Sefer Torah that was found by a Sabbatean. Okay? So, must you burn the Sefer Torah? So the Hachra, the ruling of the Tshuva Me'ava was that you must burn the Sefer Torah that was written by the Sabbatean. And the reason he says they once opened up the tefillin of the Sabbateans and they saw that they accorded a godly identity to the Shabtai Tzvi. They identified him as a god. Right? So he says, they announced publicly, this is our God. Okay? They found written on the cloth, Tzir Demut Mitznefet, HaToger U'Lamal Mitznefet, HaYakatuv Mashiach Shabtai Tzvi, Zeh Shma Shenikro Hashem Tzidkeinu. They call Shabtai Tzvi Hashem Tzidkeinu. So he says, therefore the Sabbateans are absolute heretics. They believe the Shabtai Tzvi is the God, and therefore you have to burn their Sefer Torah. They're worse than the Quran. Because apparently the Tshuva Me'ava, if he didn't want to contradict the Radvaz, would have maintained that when the Karaim wrote, the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, they had God in mind. But when the Shabtai Tzvi, the Sabatim, when they wrote the name of Hashem, they had Shabtai Tzvi in mind. That's what he determined based on what he saw them announced publicly, and also based on what they found inside the Tefillin of the Sabatim. Some people ask the question, for example, there's a certain Chassidut, we all know there, that they believe that a certain